Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with authentic learning experiences. And before we move forward with the information for this afternoon, let's go ahead and take a moment to say thank you to all of the supporters and the sponsors for this online experience. I certainly know traveling across the United States as well as across the world to attend conferences, it gets extremely expensive. So being able to do a free event from your home or from wherever you may be located at the moment is certainly a wonderful thing. Now, I know that there has been a little bit of lag time with the slide advancements, about 7 to 8 seconds, so it might take just a moment as we go from slide to slide. But I am located in Harrisburg, which is the capital of the state of Pennsylvania, which is on the East Coast over here in the United States. And I know that we have some other individuals that are from around the world, from around the country. And we can see some of those things popping up on the map. I'm sure that there will be plenty of additional people that join us later on at some point to watch this recording, because certainly it's not conducive for everyone to join the recording at this particular time of the day. Now, as I said before, it takes just a moment for some of these slides to advance. And we, as the world in which we live in, where we like that immediate response, sometimes that 7 or 8 seconds tends to be a little bit much. But welcome to Authentic Learning Experiences, a real-world approach to project-based learning. And you can find me on Twitter with Daylynn, D-A-Y-L-Y-N-N, if you're going to be tweeting anything out today. So to get started, I will tell you just a little bit about myself. I am a former classroom teacher. I spent 14 years in the social studies classroom at the high school level. I taught everything from 9th grade to 12th grade, all of the world histories, American histories, global studies. I taught government, I taught law, I taught advanced placement courses, and I also had co-taught classes with special ed students that were in my classroom that were in the same classroom with highly advanced students, in which I had a special ed teacher that co-taught that class with me. So in all of those grade levels and all of those content areas, and with all levels of students, I use project-based learning in my classroom, and more specifically, an authentic approach to project-based learning. I just recently left the classroom to do more traveling and training of teachers, as I found my life getting a little bit overwhelmed trying to manage both the classroom and the training that I did. It was about this time last year that I also published my first book on authentic learning experiences, and just like the title of this particular session, it's called A Real-World Approach to Project-Based Learning, because you can certainly do project-based learning in many, many different ways. And for me, what I found was having this authentic approach to it and making it real-world for my students was certainly the most effective in my own classroom. Because really what we want to do is we want to prepare our students for that world beyond school. That doesn't mean that our students know what their careers might be yet. But what we really want to do is to help build an interest for maybe a particular career, or help students to eliminate a possible career choice. But really what we also want to do is to build a lot of different skills that will prepare them for life beyond the classroom, and that could be applied to any career that they may or may not choose. So we want to be building our communication skills, our collaboration skills, and most definitely our critical thinking skills, all of those skills that we see students typically struggle with in the classroom. And so this authentic approach to project-based learning has really helped to promote those particular skills. So what we have here is just a little bit of a graphic to help us understand what authentic learning experiences are all about. So I know that many of you may not be from the United States, and so you don't necessarily have to worry about specific Common Core standards, or some of you might be here in the United States and your state has not adopted the Common Core standards, but we all have standards from which we may teach. And this approach is going to focus our students on those standards that really promote those critical thinking, collaboration, and communication skills. And those standards really become the core foundation of what we're building in the classroom. So we're going to start designing our authentic learning experience with what we call a challenging investigation, in which our students are going to be answering a very open-ended question for which there is no one particular right or wrong answer. That challenging investigation really should focus on a particular issue that is happening within the community sphere, and that could be a school community, a local community, a state, national, or even global community, and we'll talk about some of those examples in a little bit. Or that connection should be directly related to a specific career exploration that students may or may not decide to eventually go into after they graduate. So as we look at a challenging investigation, and our open-ended question could be and could take many, many different forms. I prefer to write an open-ended question that is very actionable in nature, and that actionable piece, of course, is going to require students to do something as they answer the question. So an open-ended question might be, how can we make our local community a more sustainable one? So that would be a challenging investigation that is directly related to the local community. And as students conduct research, as you, the teacher, scaffold out lessons for them, they're going to go through this investigation process, and whatever answer that they come up with, they need to justify that particular answer. And now they're going to do that through research that they conduct, through data analysis, through interviews that may occur, through comparative analysis that may happen. And as this process unfolds, they are continually going back and reflecting on their answers to that challenging investigation, and it may evolve and change that particular answer as they go through the process. Ultimately, once that challenging investigation has been answered and they are able to justify their answer for that, they're going to present it to some sort of an outside audience. And when I say present, that means it may or may not take the form of an actual formal presentation. You may bring a panel group in, or students may go out somewhere into the community to do a presentation, but we certainly know that we can also present information in other ways. It might be a very detailed, persuasive letter that has been written and it is sent to someone, or it could take the form of something that is posted to the web. But when we talk about that presentation of information to an outside audience, we want to make sure that that outside audience really matches the intent of our challenging investigation. So if we were to go with that question that I talked about on how can we make our community more sustainable, if we simply invite a bunch of parents to come in for an evening to hear information, that's not really an authentic outside audience. Parents tend to pat our students on the back and say, what a great job. However, if we were to involve experts on sustainability, then invite those individuals for the presentations, or have our students write letters out to them and create proposals that they submit to those experts, now it becomes a much more authentic audience. And it becomes a more meaningful audience. And when students act in that capacity, what it really does is it empowers the students to really build up a sense of, you know, I can make a difference, I can impact change. So we're going to take a look at some different examples of how these authentic learning experiences work. I'll talk about several of those very specific examples. But when we talk about authenticity and having that connection to either the community or a career specifically, we also want to think about it in terms of relevancy and complexity. Because what might be very authentic and very real world may not be very relevant to a particular student. So where I live in Harrisburg on the East Coast, I am inland about 3.5 hours from the Atlantic Ocean. So if I asked my particular students to do some work that dealt with marine life, it wouldn't be very relevant to them. While it may be very authentic, the relevancy is not there for those students because it is not their specific community or in their backyard. So we want to make sure that we're tying that authenticity piece to the relevancy. It needs to be very personal, and it also needs to be relevant in the present to our students. What might be relevant to my 9th grade students may not be very relevant to the seniors that I have that are ready to graduate. So that personal piece and also making sure the relevancy is in the present for our students is really important because that's going to allow for more ownership in this process. We want them to own the learning because ultimately we want to empower our students to impact or potentially impact change. And that final piece there is looking at the complexity issue. Students can be on very different levels of what I call this arc of learning. Students may be at a very lower level with complexity, and some students may need more complexity in a project. And you can certainly design a project to meet all levels of complexity. So when I introduced myself and talked about the fact that I taught for many years in a co-teaching situation with a special education teacher in which we had very, very low students, say a 17-year-old that read at a 1st grade level in the same classroom with another student that might be a very gifted student with a very high IQ, the complexity level at which I'm going to approach the project for those students is going to be very, very different. I certainly want to challenge each of those students. I don't want my lower level students to become very frustrated to where they give up in the process, but I also don't want a challenge to be too easy for my higher level students because they too will start to give up and get bored and just go through the motions rather than being empowered through the experience. And we want to design this in a way that we're going to promote growth for all of our students. So no matter what level they come to us at, we want to be able to challenge them appropriately so that we can set learning goals for them and they can set learning goals for themselves, and that we work to ensure that we are supporting those learning goals so that they are appropriately challenged and they are continuing to grow. So that authenticity, relevancy, and complexity piece is very, very important. So as we think about what that challenging investigation might look like, remember I said we want it to be open-ended, and we also want to ensure that we are choosing something that is very actionable for our students to do and to complete. So I would like to give you some examples of those, but what we don't want to see happen is having a question that is written in such a way that students are completely confused by that question. I know when I first started this process, I would write sentence or question stems that were so inherently complex that my students would look at me and they would give up on the project before they even started because I was really using teacher speak, or I was just simply rewriting some of my standards. So we want to write these open-ended questions in such a way that all students can understand them, no matter what level of complexity they are at. We want to write them so that they can be actionable. And what we want to do then is to write them in such a way that we are going to be preparing our students for that world beyond school. So I'm going to give you a couple of different examples, at a variety of grade levels. I chose an elementary, a middle school, and a high school level example to kind of give you a sense of what this looks like and how these authentic learning experiences can be designed for our students really at all grade levels. So in this particular sense, what we're looking at is a first grade project, and this authentic project actually took these students an entire school year to do. It was a very, very integrated, multidisciplinary project. And it was a farm-to-table study, and this took place in Boston, Massachusetts, and it comes to us out of the Young Achievers Science and Math School with two teachers, Nicole Weiner and Heidi Fessenden. And this farm-to-table study that they did, they were looking at how can we help to feed our community. And so these students started out at local farms. They studied bees, they studied vegetables, they studied poultry. As they were at these local farms and they were studying the various different types of crops that were grown or animals that were raised, they were working on their math skills with lots of data collection, creating graphs, doing sorting. As they were studying at the local farms, they also simultaneously were studying some of the Cesar Chavez social justice movement for farm workers and applying the social justice aspect to this approach. When they came back, they started a class garden. They worked on that class garden throughout the year. There was a lot more math that was involved in here with the growth of plants and how the plants were growing, and again, they're charting the growth, and they're working through this process, and they're making observations, they're making inferences, predicting what's going to happen with the growth of their garden. And through this process, they began to look at the social justice aspect of homelessness, and specifically homelessness in their local community in Boston. And ultimately, as they worked through this process and they started to harvest things from their garden, what they did was some of that food then went to the local homeless shelter so that they were able to help supply their community that was in need. They also created a calendar, and you can see this is one of the screen shots from that particular calendar. And this calendar then was sold to the community, and they donated all of their profits back to the local homeless shelters with whom they had been working through this process. So we have first grade students that are taking a very open-ended question, working through this process, how can we help to feed our local community? But it wasn't just simply let's set out some cans at local area stores and have people donate, and then we give that money to the local homeless shelter. They were learning through this process, starting with that farm piece of it, going all the way through the table piece of it, integrating the math into it, the social studies. There was lots of writing with the English language arts. All of these things to ultimately help them learn the standards as well as give back to their community. So that's one of the first grade examples, an elementary example. Now we move on to an 8th grade example that comes to us from Hampstead Academy in New Hampshire. And these 8th graders had a student in their classroom that was allergic to some different foods. And so it was always very frustrating for her as a student to be in the cafeteria, to not necessarily know what allergens were in some of the foods. And so what this 8th grade group of students did was they actually developed an allergy app called the Chow Checker. And this app won Verizon's App Challenge, and these students were able to work with MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to bring this app to a reality. So you can look for the Chow Checker and see if you can go ahead and purchase that. It is for sale, and it will help you to check what kind of allergens are in the food, and that was all done by 8th graders. This last example that I'm going to provide you with comes to us from Alabama, in the southern part of the United States, from Calera, Alabama, in a very rural part of the state. not a very wealthy part of the state. And Brian Coates, who's just a fabulous teacher down there, who teaches 9th through 12th grade pre-engineering, challenged his students to be able to make a real difference in the lives of those less fortunate than them, and to be able to truly change the world. So how can we help the lives of those less fortunate than us and truly change the world? And so here we have another example of a community context, but this community context really focuses on the global community. So what these students did is they were able to design prosthetic legs out of old car parts. Remember, this is an engineering class, and when I spoke with Brian at length, he talked to me about how he could have simply given his students patterns of some sort of design to follow and produce that, but he wanted that open-ended piece. He also wanted the students to be able to think critically about this process, and so they had to design the legs themselves out of these old car parts. Now, they worked with lots of experts, with some different manufacturing companies that actually produce prosthetic legs to ensure that everything was ergonomically correct with them and functioning properly, and they had a lot of feedback from those companies. And ultimately, the students were able to raise the funds to ship the prosthetic legs down to Honduras. They were also able to raise enough money so that they were able to travel down to Honduras, and they would then they were able to actually fit those amputees with the prosthetic legs. And so you can see a picture of the students down there, and you can also see the amputees in Honduras receiving their legs. At the same time, while these students were down there, they had also developed some basic utility vehicles that they had designed. Again, had shipped these down to Honduras and then helped these communities be able to learn how to use these basic utility vehicles to drill for well water. So certainly answering that challenging question on how they could truly change the world. And in this example, certainly a global context for the global community rather than simply the community in our own backyard. You know, when we're working with students, oftentimes we really focus simply on the grades. And I think that you can probably tell in the 3 preceding examples that I provided you with, students, you know, when they get involved in these authentic learning experiences, grades really tend to not matter to them anymore. In my own experience, in my own classroom, students never asked me, well, what grade did I get on this project? They were more concerned about celebrating the effects of the project, and we're so excited. Mrs. Laur, did you hear that? Did you hear when they said this? Or did you see that letter that I received back? Or how I helped to change this person's life? So the grade piece really doesn't matter to them. Now, I know in the world in which we live, in education, grades still mean an awful lot to other entities, and we still have to have grades. So I'm not telling you to throw grades out the window. You can certainly still give end of the unit tests if you like. I chose to, with the exception of my AP government class, I got rid of all of the tests that I gave except for my end of course assessments that were required by the state, because I felt like I was truly able to assess the understanding of my students through these authentic learning projects rather than just focusing on those students who are great at memorizing information and regurgitating it back on a test. And again, I know in the world in which we live in education, we still have those wonderful things called standardized tests that we just can't seem to get rid of yet. And it's a lot of filling in the bubbles. But I do think that there is still hope for us yet. The College Board has certainly shifted the AP testing. They've started that with biology and AP US history and some different ones. And they are making that shift to more critical thinking questions rather than simple memorization questions. We also see, for those of you that are in states that are involved with the Common Core state standards, that we are looking at some tests like Smarter Balance that are creating these performance tasks that are focusing on the critical thinking aspects. So really, these authentic learning experiences are helping to promote that critical thinking piece, so it is not just about the memorization, because all too frequently we see our students that are very, very frustrated. I have two daughters. One of my daughters is in the 4th grade and one is in kindergarten. And there's nothing worse than having my 4th grader come home and being so upset over homework that she doesn't understand, when in the end, really that homework is just nothing more than busy work. And oftentimes she's frustrated because of the amount of time that it takes her to do that busy work, where she's spending an hour writing down spelling lists in multiple colors and creating different shapes out of it, which really is doing nothing more than taking up a lot of time and asking her to memorize the spelling words. It's not teaching her how to spell. It's not having her think critically about the spelling. It's not having her practice the use of those spelling words, say in writing a letter to send to an elected official to try and change something. So we often see a lot of different students frustrated. So this authentic learning experience, where we're appropriately placing students on that complexity level that we talked about before, will help us to have students who are a little bit more happy in school. It doesn't mean that I am about entertaining students. Far from it. I'm not there to entertain my students, and quite frankly, I don't like to hear the word engagement in education. I prefer to hear the word empowerment, because we might see students involved in a task, and as they are involved in that task, they are so focused on that task. They may not be jumping for joy at that moment, but they are working toward an end goal because they know that that end goal is going to be very meaningful. So when they see the results of their work, that's when we see that empowerment piece. Because can you imagine those students that went down to Honduras, that they had developed those prosthetic legs and they were able to fit those amputees? That's what I talk about when I mean empowerment. So as we're thinking about this process of authentic learning experiences and moving from frustration to this empowerment piece, and we know that we want to start with this challenging investigation. I gave you 3 very, very specific examples of how those challenging investigations were implemented, and I would encourage you to look around to see what kind of things are happening in your own community. Again, your local community, your state, your national, and even the global community, to see what types of challenges we can establish for our students. So I'm just going to give you a couple of ideas. A lot of my ideas come from watching the news, reading the newspaper, flipping through a magazine. A lot of things, ideas come to me simply by reading through Twitter and hearing about different things that are going on in the world. And some of these ideas actually come from my students too, because remember, we want to focus on that relevancy piece and what is relevant to them. And so if we look at this slide, I'm sure a lot of different things come to mind. So if you are live during the session now, if you want to type in maybe some examples of what might come to mind as an open-ended question or a challenge or a problem that you could have students solve dealing with this particular picture, you can go ahead and type that in now. Some of you may have not thought that this was going to be an interactive session. So as I was thinking about what kind of pictures to use and which ones to purchase off of my photo accounts, I was thinking about a trip that I took recently with my girls and my husband as we were driving, and we saw all of these windmills as we were passing through the top of the mountain. And my girls were talking an awful lot about these windmills, and my husband, who is a scientist, was giving them a lot of information about the windmills, and they had lots of wonderful questions about them. And so, as I was thinking about this process, and thinking about what a potential question could be as they are looking at different types of energy. A question could be, how can we make our community more energy efficient? Or perhaps you could focus on how could we convince our local government to come or to bring a particular type of energy into our community, whether it be wind energy, or I live about 10 miles down the road from a nuclear power plant. For any of you that are familiar with 3 Mile Island and the disaster that happened there in the 1970s, you know, that's where I live, so it certainly impacts my community. So you could do something around convincing your local community to support a particular type of energy to be brought into your community and the costs that are associated with that versus the benefits that would come out of it. So that's one particular possibility, or actually two particular possibilities that we might think about here. For this one, looking at the graffiti, maybe we're taking a look at how could we decrease the frequency of graffiti in our community. Certainly this was a major problem that New York City had for a number of years, and you can look at in all of the different things that took place in that community. In our local communities, we know that we have graffiti problems, and so that could be one of those investigations that students take a look at. Now, when we think about authentic learning experiences, we want to make sure that they truly are authentic, keeping all of those different elements that I described, the challenging investigation, the connection to career community, the justification piece, and then that outside audience. Because in project-based learning, often what I find is many teachers create simulations. And so what I've done here is I've created a comparison chart on the differences between simulations and authentic learning experiences. So there is nothing wrong with including simulations in the classroom. I've done plenty of simulations in the classroom over the years. But what I've found is the simulations really simply still produce the same type of results in my classroom. The students that were really wanting to get good grades would participate in the simulation for the sake of good grades. Some students would participate because they thought it was entertaining and maybe it did engage them, but ultimately it wasn't empowering them. So when I use simulations now in the classroom, I'm going to use those simulations to support something larger of the authentic learning experience, something that is much more purpose-driven, where they're solving that challenging investigation. Again, you can have activities that take place in your classroom, but let's use those activities to support the larger authentic learning experience, because that authentic learning experience is going to be much more of an extended experience. In some cases, I've had my authentic learning experiences last as long as 8 weeks. In that 8-week time period, of course, there's a lot of significant content that is included in the authentic learning experience, as well as a whole host of standards that are being addressed through that process. The elementary example that we looked at earlier was a year-long process, and certainly there were many, many different things that were incorporated into that because it was an interdisciplinary project. We want our content knowledge to be very deep. We want it to be inquiry-driven. We want that depth of knowledge to be from day one until however many days we go through this process, because the inquiry process is so imperative. We want students to continually ask questions, and you can continually ask questions to promote more of a deeper understanding for your students. You can invite experts in to challenge your students to think deeper and to dig deeper, because we want them to get lots of feedback as they go through this process, as they continue to justify their answers to the challenging investigation. I don't want my students to simply read about experts. Of course, case studies are a great thing, and we can read about what experts have done in the field, but until students are involved with experts, it doesn't mean quite as much. I can only be so much of an expert. I'm an expert in education, but I can read books and relate to them information, but I've never actually put those things into practice. Even though I taught a law course for 14 years, I was never a lawyer. So we need to have that expert involvement that is involved in this process as well. I don't want my students to be replicating anything. I'm not going to show them samples at the beginning or models that they should follow. I want it to be innovative for them. I could do one of these projects multiple times over with many, many different students, and we would see that there would be many different answers to that challenging investigation because we're asking for that open-ended piece and we want our students to be innovative. Replication versus innovation, again, as we go through the process, if your questions are open-ended enough, you are going to see the innovation is going to occur versus the replication. Producing something from a classroom is going through the motions. Even producing something for another classroom tends to be going through the motions because the audience really isn't an authentic, purpose-driven one. So if we have that community or even a global audience, that's when we find what I call leveling up in a product. So students are going to be completing this for someone other than myself. They're going to be doing it for more than just a grade. And as we get those experts involved, that's when we're going to see the true engagement, empowerment, purpose behind completing this project happen. Of course, I have to grade my students because that's the nature of the game. But instead of focusing on the teacher assessment, really now the focus is on the audience assessment. Were those amputees able to walk or use those prosthetic legs that were built by those students in Calera, Alabama? That's a true audience assessment versus how the teacher is assessing. Because now we're not just looking at the grading outcome, but we're looking at purpose, we're looking at need, and we're also looking at meaning. And so that's what is truly going to empower our students to move forward in this process. As you design an authentic learning experience, you have to think about what your final product might be. And I always, as I work with teachers, ask them to internalize the question, is this just a research paper in disguise? Frequently, teachers will say, well, I'm going to have my students create an iMovie on this particular topic that answers the driving question. Well, is that just a research paper that is a little more flashy? Or is there truly in-depth investigation that has occurred through this process? We want our students not just to be consumers of information, but we want them to be producers of new information. And simply creating an iMovie does not necessarily make them a producer of information. They very well may be just consuming the information and then regurgitating that information, but now instead of writing a research paper, they're creating an iMovie. It looks flashy, it uses the technology, but it's simply just that research paper in disguise. When you're thinking about these products too, we want to make sure that we can truly assess the understanding of the students in whatever the significant content is that they should have been utilizing, as well as any of the standards that needed to be met. And so I just recently wrote a blog post on whether or not the 30-second PSA is the appropriate product for an authentic learning experience. That 30-second PSA is not going to be able to really dig deeply into the content. If I assess that 30-second PSA on content, there's not a whole lot that I can get out of that. And how can I assess whether or not that 30-second PSA is really impacting whatever intended audience that it may have? So I'm going to take a look at one of the examples that came in here in the chat. How can we limit the effect of noise pollution from the growth of Heathrow Airport from affecting the everyday lives of this nearby community? That is a wonderful question. I love that question. You know, it's in the backyard of where you live. It becomes very relevant to them, the students, because it's going to affect them on a daily basis. So that's a fabulous question. It is a fabulous question. You know, I just returned yesterday from Chicago. I was in Chicago for a couple of days, and as I was getting onto the plane on both instances, I was thinking about a lot of different challenging investigations that could be dealing with airplanes. So what we see is when we are utilizing the authentic learning experience in the classroom, it's like a domino effect. You know, students that previously were not enjoying school now feel that sense of empowerment, and when we focus the appropriate level on complexity, we're going to see growth in all of our students from day one until the end of the semester or the end of the school year. There's going to be a lot of growth, and you're also going to see this type of learning spread from teacher to teacher. Even if it's by word of mouth of the students, but certainly there's also going to be a lot of attention on what's happening because you may be involving your community directly. These are great opportunities for PR for your school and to build and strengthen that community context and that community partnership with your school. And so really it's a domino effect as we go through this particular process, because we know that learning really should never end. And if we are in the classroom and we are simply teaching a unit for that end of the unit test in which our students are regurgitating that information, we have to ask our question, the question to ourselves: have they truly learned anything? Have they internalized this information, or have they merely memorized the information, or in some cases maybe not been able to memorize the information for that end grade on the test? But we want learning to never end with our students. Authentic learning experiences are a great way to ensure that that doesn't happen. So some next steps that you might want to take. As I mentioned before, look in your own backyard, read the newspaper, look at the news, ask your students what's relevant to them as you think about how to develop some of these authentic learning experiences. You may want to take a look at my blog. I just decided a couple of weeks ago that I was going to start blogging, so I've been sharing those blogs on DaynaLaur.com because what I found was I was tweeting out an awful lot of things, and I wanted to be able to do that in more than 140 characters. Or you can take a look at all of the different examples from some wonderful teachers around the country that I included in my Authentic Learning Experiences, a real-world approach to project-based learning book. So at this time, we have about 15 minutes or so before your next session. If you do have any questions, feel free to type those into the chat now. You can also, if you don't have questions now and you want to internalize some of this information, think about it and ask questions of me later, you can certainly do that. You can reach me in any number of ways. If you are on Twitter, you can send me a tweet and you can ask me a question that way. I am DAYLYNN on Twitter. You can send me an email, daynalaur@gmail.com, or you can contact me through my website, daynalaur.com. So I will be on from now until 3 o'clock. And if you have any questions, I type them in and I will answer those. If you are anxious to get to the next session and you want to get yourself situated and maybe take a quick detour to the kitchen to grab something to eat or a snack before your next session starts, I understand that as well. But I do thank you for joining me over the last 45 minutes or so. And let's see, I do have a question here. What hardships do you always face in your solution? I'm wondering about the interpretation of that with the hardships. I'm not exactly sure what it is that you mean by hardships. If you could perhaps explain that a little bit further. Do I mean aggressive students or disinterested students? So really it is the way in which you approach it. So if I were to tell my students that we're going to start a project tomorrow and you're going to be required to read 300 pages of court documents, and you're going to have to call police officers and attorneys and different individuals that were involved in an investigation, I'm going to get an awful lot of students that are looking at me like I'm crazy. You know, I'm getting ready to graduate, Mrs. Laur, why should I be involved in this process? I'm not reading 300 pages worth of court documents. I'm not interviewing all these people. But it's the way in which you approach it. So starting out with what the Buck Institute for Education calls an entry event, something that is going to start the inquiry process and immediately involve the students in the process and pique their interest in the process and introduce them to the driving question, is the way in which you really gain their attention. I'm not saying that this approach will work for 100% of the students across the board. You're always going to have a student or two that, for whatever reason, is very, very difficult to reach, but I've certainly seen the number of students in my own experience skyrocket in terms of getting very, very involved. So parents and the public, yes, absolutely. You know, I've had parents say to me, this is the first time that my child has really been interested in school or has brought homework from school that they didn't have to do but they wanted to do to work on this project to make it better. And the public themselves, you know, very infrequently do I encounter anyone in the professional world that turns me down for helping out with a particular project. They're generally very, very open to that and encourage it, in fact. And so, again, it's a great way to build that partnership between the school and the community. And it's also a great way for students to you know, be seen in a totally different light. Instead of all of the negative things that we see happening, you know, we want to see those positive interactions with the community. And this is a great way to do that. Okay, let me take a look at this one here. How do I manage to pull this off time-wise with all the other pressures, especially exams? So, you know, there's always state testing to be involved in, end-of-the-course assessments. For me, here in the United States with advanced placement courses, I was very, very resistant to actually implement this in that class because I was so worried about the end-of-the-course assessment where my students had to score a particular score in order to get college credit for the course, and that was an awful lot of pressure. And so I really held off on implementing this in that classroom until my students were the ones that convinced me to do so. And they convinced me to do so by saying, Mrs. Laur, just wouldn't it be great if we did this and we could try this? And I finally acquiesced and said, all right, let's give it a shot. And what I found was, as my students actually designed more of the experience than I did, I kind of sat back and watched it all unfold as more of an observer than anything else. And certainly, you know, I would jump in and facilitate as needed. But what I found was my students were designing experiences that implemented and integrated different units together, where I had actually segmented those units and said, you know, okay, we're going to spend 4 weeks on this unit, and then we'll spend 3 weeks on this unit. They were picking and pulling from different units to where it made much more sense to them versus, you know, this is what the textbook has laid out and says that students should be learning in these segmented pieces. And so while I was worried about the time factor, the scores on the tests that year just went way up because the students had something very concrete, very concrete in terms of we've experienced this versus something very abstract that they had just read. So working with online pieces, you know, as we move forward every day, every week, every month, you know, there's more and more opportunity to expand this type of learning worldwide. When I started doing authentic learning with my students about 7 or 8 years ago, it was much more limited in context. Now, you know, it is just so easy to make those worldwide connections. I think the only barrier ever is, you know, trying to adjust for time zones in terms of communication sometimes. Well, it looks like most everyone has left the session, so thank you for taking the time to spend with me over the last nearly an hour. And for those of you that watched the recording of this, I hope that you too find it useful even though you were unable to join the live session. And again, feel free to send me any questions or comments as they may arise. I certainly love to expand my personal learning community as you know, we're able to grow together and not only ask questions of me, but also be able to share some great experiences with me as well. Thank you once again, and have a great rest of your day.